Well, also the the lack of a license plate on the back of your vehicle tends to attract quite a bit of attention with the officers.
That disrupts society, I think they call that.
Whether or not you owe the tax or not, it's irrelevant. The fact that you have to have a certain amount of paperwork, you have to have a number on your vehicle for them to identify it and you buy. And it must correspond. If you don't own that vehicle according to the paperwork, then they want to know why. And they're going to investigate into why and who and all these different particulars, which are your private rights. You have no reason to give those up to an officer or anybody else. And yet all these things become conditioned to the right to drive. And if you look at the common man who's not too knowledgeable about the law and not too much in tune to questioning the authority of his government because of the way he's been raised, what does he know about this? He's basically scared and coerced and intimidated into not carrying the gun, not driving the car unless he's got everything in order. He can have the gun in his car, but it's basically just a wall hanger at that point because it's not loaded. It's no good to him as a defense weapon. You know, if you imagine, stop a minute, Mr. Burglar, I've got to load my gun before I can avert this crime. And wouldn't you please call an officer so I don't have to use it at all because I'm afraid I'm going to be thrown in jail after I use it. So where are the inalienable rights that this country is founded on? What citizen can claim them? What citizen dares to claim his rights? This is what's coming down today. And just to let you know where we're coming from on a position of rights, these rights are not to be had, we know, by the timid or the ignorant. But we must have somebody somewhere stand up for those rights.
Yeah, that's the belligerent claimant in person. Well, I guess the last area we need to cover now is that being, and the absolute rights, is that of property. We've already covered property in great detail. It's just the right of ownership, the right to use, the right to enjoy, and the right to get rid of it or to throw it away or whatever you want to do. And I don't think we're going to elaborate on that anymore. We'll just go on to the next subject. There's nothing wrong with that, is there? Here we go. We're back on the rights issues again, part of property. And we're going to talk now is about relative rights. I'm going to break it into two categories. First of all is public and private. Let's talk about our public rights, first of all. Let me give you a clear quote here. These are which subsist between the people and government. Between people and government. Remember, we can't have rights specifically because they're only between persons. But there is a relationship between government and persons, natural persons, that is, that must exist in order for you to have a stable government. And they subsist between the people and the government as the right of protection on the part of the people and the right of allegiance, which is due people to the government. So you have to have a right of protection there and allegiance to go along with it. And that's the function of government, to protect our property. And, of course, we in turn need to show them some allegiance. Needless, give us a good quote on that, will you?
I've got a darn good quote on that. This comes from Justice Brandeis, who was a justice of the Supreme Court for many years, and this was quoted in 1928. In fact, he's the one that gave the Erie Railroad decision in 1938. Decency, security, and liberty alike demand that government officials shall be subjected to the same rules of conduct that are commands to the citizen. If a government of laws existence, let's see, I screwed that one up. In a government of laws, the existence of the government will be imperiled if it fails to observe the law scrupulously. Our government is the potent, the omnipresent teacher. For good or for ill, it teaches the whole people by its example. Isn't that amazing? The government then becomes supposedly the standard of law in the society. I think that's obvious in this society. Crime is contagious. If the government becomes a lawbreaker, it breeds contempt for the law. It invites every man to become a law unto himself. It invites anarchy. To declare that in the administration of criminal law, the end justifies the means would bring terrible retribution. Against that pernicious doctrine, this court should resolutely set its face. That's in Olmstead versus U.S. 277, 438. Very good.
What other protections should we have from our government?
Well, all of the immunities of a citizen against certain kinds of activity from the government have to be recognized. And in the subject matter of allegiance to the government, A man owes certain amounts of duty to his government because he formed the government in the Constitution. Part of this duty is the duty of being a witness on a criminal trial, because the Fifth Amendment guarantees any accused man the right to have witnesses. So then it becomes a duty of anybody who is a witness to come and to testify. Another duty to the government is the duty to seek to help the law enforcement, to help the sheriff when he needs deputies. It's also to protect your neighbors when there's a crime being done. If you see a murder or a robbery going on down the street, it's your duty as a citizen of the government to go down and try to avert a crime or try to stop the crime from going into its full effect. This is part of our allegiance to government. Now, this theory of allegiance to government has been twisted by people, and it's been carried out to the effect that a man owes his entire life and every bit of property he's got to the commands of the legislature. But that's carrying it too far. That isn't the kind of allegiance that we're required to give. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think that's enough said on that issue. And so let's get on then to the private rights. And to whom do private rights exist between? They exist between reciprocal rights, or there's reciprocal rights. Let's take, for example, a husband and wife. They have rights between them, and we discussed that a little bit earlier. We also have a parent and child relationship, and there's certain rights that exist between a parent and a child. One has the duty and the obligation to teach the other one, and one has the obligation to learn, for example. And the same way with a guardian or ward or master-servant type relationship. But let's not make the government our master here and become the slave in that environment. And we're not supposed to have any of that, and that went out with the 13th Amendment, hopefully. Okay, so much for public and private rights. Let's move on then to legal and equitable type rights. What then are legal rights? That is, the former being legal rights, the party has the right, the legal title to a thing, and in that case his remedy for an infringement of it is by an action in a court of law. Now let's stop and think about it. He has a legal title to a thing, and if he has a remedy or a problem with an infringement of that right, he has an action in a court of law. Court of law? Nevis, what's a court of law?
Well, a court of law is a law wherein a man can come at remedies by the common law or in equity. And those are the jurisdictions that are part of our constitutional government. That's the judicial power of the United States, and especially any right that arises under the Constitution.
Okay, where tangible assets, though, are concerned, and we're talking about property, we're going into a court of law versus a court of equity, which would come from our equitable rights, if you will. And therefore, equitable rights would be those which may be enforced in a court of equity. Now we've got this problem with the chosen action and things of this nature where more than one party may be a party of interest. For example, in an automobile, when you buy one of these things, generally you mortgage it to some company. And you don't really have title to that automobile. The mortgage company has title, and they're letting you use it while you pay for it. So you have some equity in that vehicle or in your home or whatever it might be. But if that property is damaged, you have more than one party of interest. You're interested because you were driving it and you have a certain equity in it. But the title holder, or the person who has the right of possession, again, remember those terms from the property issue we were talking about? The actual right of possession is in the mortgage holder, not in the person driving the automobile. He just has actual possession. But the right of possession is in that person that holds that title, and that's being the mortgage company. So if this vehicle is damaged by a third party, both the mortgagee and the person who has the actual possession are interested. And they're both going into a court of equity and try to settle that issue, I would imagine. There's a lot of things you could take to a court of equity. And Nelis, why don't you give us a couple more here real quick?
Well, a man that sees the damage threatening to come he's entitled to go into the court and seek an equitable relief against it by injunction or writ of prohibition or temporary restraining order. For example, we found that the best way to handle this traffic code is, instead of trying to argue our rights in the criminal action in the traffic court, to seek a declaratory judgment, which is more of a civil case in the district court, and therein to get a restraining order against the traffic court action until such time as the civil issue is decided. Now, this is a case of equity, granting the restraining order while the issue of rights is decided. Because before you can punish a man, he must be clearly and unmistakably within the statute, says the Supreme Court. So go ahead.
Well, let's go back to this land issue a little bit. We've talked about property, but we didn't use the word land and define that term in relationship to the term property when we're talking about ground. Different word altogether. Land is any ground, soil, or earth whatsoever, as meadows, pastures, woods, waters, marshes, and the like. Now we get into the meat of this. The term land denotes the quantity and the character of the interest or estate which the tenant may hold in land. Some important words there. The land is one thing, and the estate in land is another. For an estate in land is in time, and in time in land or land for a time. Well, that's confusing. Needless explain that to me so I know what I read.
Well, you have a man who owns land, and you have a man who lives on land. A tenant simply has possession of the land. But the estate in land would be called property, isn't that?
Yeah, that's the way I see that. So when you say that you own land, what you really mean is I have an interest in it, or I have the right of possession in the sense that I'm actually possessing it, but I may not have the actual right of possession. That means that I can kick somebody else off my land, because only the person that has the actual right of possession, or the estate and freeholder in fee simple, has that power.
Isn't the right of possession the right to enter the land?
Right, to enter and to dispel anybody that's there.
Turn out the occupants.
Yeah, turn out the occupants.
What do we have exactly in the property tax situation, for example? If a man fails to pay his yearly ground rent, and that's a good term to use on that. Ground rent was something that the feudal system imposed on a man. If you fail to do that, you'll find that the sheriff will come and turn you out and let some other tenant come and own the land if he will pay the amount of fealty that you failed to pay.
Let's analyze this also from the mortgage company's perspective on this tax issue, and I don't know whether this has been covered before, but this land tenant person is he who actually possesses the land, and he's the guy that's going to pay the tax. But when you have the mortgage company involved, the mortgage company actually owns the land, and you're just a tenant on it until it's paid for. So they can tax that land, and I don't think there's any question about that, because that's a corporation, and you can tax corporations right out of existence. But when that final payment is made, it becomes the man's land, becomes that natural person's land. Now we've got a new situation. We have a freehold or an allodial land piece of property here, and we'll talk a little bit more about that a little later. But let's talk about this land tax just a little bit more from the perspective of the definition. And we see that land tax was a tax on the beneficial proprietor of a land, such as is imposed in many of the states, so far as a tenant is beneficial proprietor and no further. The tenant? Isn't that what we are? So far as a tenant is beneficial proprietor and no farther. So as long as you're the tenant or you're paying for that land or a servant of some other entity and you just have actual possession versus the right of possession, well, then you've got to pay that land tax. Now, I don't see any way around that. What do you think, Neelis?
Well, a tenant is the man who has possession of the land, but he doesn't necessarily own it. We know that if a man owns a piece of land outright, then he doesn't have to live there. He can have another man own, or carry on possession of it, and then that man would be termed the tenant. But the actual owner doesn't even have to possess the land physically. He has a right to possess, and that is the ownership.
But from the position of the tax, though, we can tax the tenant, can't we?
It would. I wouldn't say for sure.
You don't want to say for sure?
I wouldn't say for sure.
Well, I understand that to be that way. Let's go back over that again. A tax on the beneficial proprietor of such land as is imposed in many of the states, so far as a tenant is a beneficial proprietor. And I'm talking about the mortgage company, what you're doing. I'm not really taxing the tenant through that. When that thing's mortgaged, what we're really doing is taxing the corporation. But the corporation is going to incorporate that in the price of that property, and they're going to suck it out of the tenant. So maybe I misstated my position there a little bit. But I think that's what we really have there. We're taxing the tenant indirectly through the corporation.
The problem with the property tax falling on land, as I discussed earlier, is that the state acquires a lien or an interest in the land by the operation of the statute. If the state then can gain an interest simply by passing a statute in all the land in the state, all the private property in the state, then what have we got? It's simple. We have a lord paramount, or a landlord over all land in the state.
Is that King George?
Well, that's the same thing as the William the Conqueror formulated in 1086 or whenever it was that he conquered, or supposedly conquered, the British Isles. He claimed to have the sole allodium from that point on, and such it has been to this day, that the allodium rests in the crown and not in the individual owner.
Okay. Well, we talked about this tenant, and if you're the tenant on the land, I'll read your definition here, that a tenant is one who holds or possesses land tenements by any kind of title, either in fee, life, or years, and etc. In a popular sense, he is one who has the temporary use and occupation of lands or tenements which belong to another. And aren't we actually talking about having a temporary occupancy? Because as long as you specifically perform to your state through the sales tax on that land, then you have temporary occupancy. But if you fail to perform specifically, then you're going to lose your land, because the Lord Paramount, or King George, or however you want to title the government, is going to evict you from that land and have a sheriff's sale, and they're going to give it to somebody who will be a better tenant. I don't know who that person is, but that's exactly how the system functions, and that's called feudalism, and we got rid of that 200 years ago in this country. Supposedly. Now we're going to move into this word allodial, and this is a very interesting word, and the best definition for the word allodial actually is found under a word called tenure. I don't want to discuss the word tenure, because that's nothing more than time, but in there we find the real definition of the word allodial. In the earlier ages of the world, the condition of land was probably allodial, that is, without subjection to any superior. Every man occupying as much land found unappropriated as his necessities required. Over this he exercised an unqualified dominion. And when he parted with his ownership, the possession of his successor was equally free and absolute. There's those words again, free and absolute. And a state of this character necessarily excludes the idea of tenure. We've done away with tenure now, no tenant relationship, since the occupant owes no service or no allegiance to any superior as the condition of his occupation, to include the state.
I think there that the definition of tenure does have some relevance, because a tenure is basically a hold. It comes from the Latin, and that's where we get the word tenuous and all that. But the tenure was a hold on the land. Now, when a man owns property, when he has property rights in something, it becomes proper to him. That's the Latin word for property. It is proper to oneself. It becomes virtually a part of oneself. It's inseparable from the individual. To separate the individual from his property would be to take away his sovereignty and take away his individuality. For what is proper to one man is alien to another. And this was the old word for to describe when a man sold his land. That would be alienating himself from his holding, from his tenement. And to alienate yourself from something is to put it away from you and disclaim any right and title to it from then on. So you can see that the word property has a very deep meaning, and it's a very important meaning that we discuss it. We shouldn't use it lightly as we always do. We talk about a piece of land being property. Well, a piece of land is only the subject of property. Don't we have a quote on that?
I don't have that right off the top of my head here, but let me give you the next one, the best I can do here. In the United States, and this is where it gets important to us personally, in the United States, every estate in fee simple, and that's what type of titles that we have, our fee simple titles, is held as absolutely and unconditionally as is comparable with the state's rights of eminent domain. Now, I think there's some important words there.
Boy,
here we go.
Eminent domain is the right to take, the right of the state, then, to take property for a public use when it is absolutely necessary to the existence of the state and the security of all the people. As we know, actions of eminent domain are only brought upon by due course of law, and there must be a just compensation paid to the property owner. They don't just come out and say, well, we want that piece of land, we're going to build a ditch or a road or something and take it. There has to be an action wherein the man can be heard and the value of the land can be arbitrated over and decided in a judicious manner.
We would say then that the basic right of a person to have property, or the property rights of an individual to own land, are so basic that they're inseparable with life itself. Wouldn't that be our position?
Absolutely.
And that you can't take a man's property, that being the land that he owns, without an eminent domain power. Wouldn't that be correct? And then therefore, taking a man's property because he fails to perform a tax is unlawful and illegal, that you can't do that. Now, how to fight that's another story sometime, but we're just trying to give you principles behind this right now. Let's talk then a little bit about estate. Estate, the condition or circumstances in which the owner stands with reference to his property, the degree, the quality, the nature, and extent of interest which a person has in real property. Now, there are several types of estates, if I'm not mistaken. Neelis, how many can you think of offhand?
Several. But an estate can be not only a corporeal hereditament, which is a tangible property, but also an incorporeal, which is an intangible right.
Okay, then the estate is the degree, the quality, the nature, and extent of interest which one has in real property, as in the estate in fee, whether the same be a fee simple, fee tail, or an estate life, or for years, and etc. So there we see the fee tail coming out in this estate for life, and I think I've got something on that somewhere here. This estate for life, or estate of freehold, anyhow. The estate of freehold. Any estate of inheritance or for life. You just can't take it away from man. Remember, he can pass it on to his successors also without encumbrance. This exists or arises from real property of free tenure. A freehold indeed is the real possession of land or tenements in fee or fee tail or for life. Freehold in law is the right to such tenements before entry. The right before entry. So you have the right to that before you ever go on the land. And once you bought it, it should be yours and you should be able to go on it and to occupy it and to do anything you want to without subjection to rules from your government who wish to take it away from you because you don't perform again.
You'll notice how many times the word freedom and free and all that, it comes up in this discussion of ownership and property. Obviously, freedom comes from the right to own property. Without the right to own property, there would be no freedom.
That's absolutely correct. If you can't own something, how could we be free? We can't even own and possess ourselves. If we can't own and possess our own movements and our own capacity to think, we just can't be free. And that goes along with land of all types or possessions of any type. You've either got to be able to own it or they belong to somebody else. Now, where does this leave the personal property tax when they want to tax you for your furniture and things of that nature? It's just out to lunch. You just can't do that to a man's property. Now, the corporation's property or trade, commerce, and industry, we don't have a problem with that. But you can't tax a man's property like that, or it's not his. He's just renting it. So then he's not only forced to buy it in order to have it to use, then he's got a perpetual performance that he has to perform the rest of his life, or at least the rest of the life of that particular piece of property. So he's never paid it off. He pays it off to the person to whom he gets it from, then he has to pay it off the rest of the time to the state. It doesn't make any sense at all.
Well, if it were pure and simple debt, a man can pay a debt. He can extinguish the thing and never have to be obligated to it again. But obviously, this isn't a debt. It's a servant relationship. It's a debt service.
Well, what did you ask those people up there in Elmore County about that, about your land when they was talking about that tax issue?
Well, I told them it looked like feudalism, and I asked them, what right do you have to my property? Why is it that the county seems to have a lien or an equitable title to my property? And there was no answer. And one of the commissioners did agree later on that it did look like feudalism, and he said that was the reason why the Quakers and the Pilgrims came to this country in the first place, was to get rid of the feudalism. And he agreed that there was a problem.
Didn't you ask him about, possessing other property if they wanted that piece, that you could have another one somewhere?
Yeah, I asked him if they would buy me out of my property and pay me my equitable interest, and then they could go ahead and have that piece of land, just if they just tell me where I could go get a piece of land that I could own.
Yeah, because, see, if you have to pay for it forever, you just can't possibly own it. Somebody else is owning it, and you're just performing on that piece of property in a tenant relationship. It just can't be. Okay, now we get back to this word allodial, or allode again. It is a term used in opposition to fiefdom or fief. Now, did we tell them what a fief and a fiefdom was?
Well, we've been explaining a tenants and servants service to the landlord, and that's exactly what a fiefdom is. It's the tenement of the feudal serf.
Yeah. Fief or fiefdom, which means a property, the use of which was bestowed upon another by the proprietor on condition that the grantee should perform certain services for the grantor, and upon the failure of which the property would revert to the original possessor. And that's where we're at again. That's fiefdom, and that's your feudal system. You're performing again for the state, because the state has got the right to turn you out any time that you fail to perform. So we must have fiefs and fiefdoms, not any allodial property rights out there. Okay, another definition then would be an estate held by absolute ownership without recognizing any superior to whom any duty is due on account thereof. And we basically read definitions like that. But it's nice to reiterate to see that there are different sources all the time. And the sources I'm giving you are still out of Bovier's Law Dictionary, 1914. This come out of a 2-volume set. But every one of these definitions just about have a source in here. And when I look at this paragraph or a sentence that I read you, Just below that, you'll find the actual source of that particular definition out of some case law somewhere in earlier history, or out of Blackstone's commentaries, or Cope, or Littleton, or somebody. Okay, another one then. In the United States, the title to land is essentially allodial, and every tenant in fee simple has an absolute and unqualified dominion over it.
What about zoning laws? What about planning and building codes? And what about dominion? Who has the dominion over land today? I'd say it was the counties.
Yeah, I think that's right. Now, the problem is, how do we get out of this system, and can we even get out of this system? And with the county owning the land, and they're the lowest echelon in the whole chain of command in our government who does this, and they go out and, well, you tell us how that works. How do they go out and get this possession, or how do they get this value on the land?
Well, the assessor finds the property on his rolls, and he goes out and looks at the land and sees what kind of use, whether it's agriculture or development or what kind of community it's placed in. And there's been many, many farmers taxed out of existence just because a couple of subdivisions came up around them, and their tax assessments rose and rose and rose. How does land become worth more? The demand for it can increase, yes, and that would make the land worth more. But what we have today is more than just that. We have an inflationary spiral today, and the money becomes worth less. And now that makes the land appear to be worth more because the number of Federal Reserve notes it can be sold for increases. But the land will not produce more. The land can only produce a certain amount, and let's assume the farmer is producing all that he can on the land at the point at which the assessor then increases the assessment on him. Well, you can see what it's doing. It's shutting him out. It's anti-productive, and he's going to be closed out, and he's going to have to sell. Who's the highest bidder? A developer. Now we have the land taken out of production and put into pavement and lots, a sewer system underneath, and a whole bunch of expenditure put on it, and a whole bunch of people moving in that have to depend on some other farmer now to supply their food. So this is a continuing process that's caused the takeover of an awful lot of our land in this country.
Yeah, I think this all got started back some time ago when they had corporations and this type of thing, and you can tax those people again right out of existence. They're artificial in nature. They owe their allegiance to the state, and they have no rights specifically. They have certain limited powers, again, granted to them by their charter from the state. But the state created corporations, and they can do anything they want to with them. Regulate them. They can get driver's license, registration, insurance. They can tax their assets. And I think this property tax needs to be looked at from that standpoint. If a corporation owns property, it should probably go on the tax rolls, and the county assessor should evaluate it and this sort of thing, and could get a tax based upon the valuation. Now, I have some problems with taxing the land based upon valuation when it comes to a natural person, because a tax on land is a direct tax, and we know about direct taxes from our Constitution. They've got to be laid in accordance to appropriation amongst the several states. Now, how do you do that? Well, if you're going to tax land, it's got to be a direct tax on the person through the land. Now, if you're going to do that, then you're going to have to say, well, a man owns 10 acres, or he owns 5 acres, or he owns 2 acres, or 3 acres, and you've got to come up with a valuation per acre, not a valuation of the property of which you would tax. Because we can see what happens in our current economy as the inflation increases, the value of the property is constantly increasing in relationship to Federal Reserve notes. It hasn't increased in value. Land has always been there and has always been worth the same amount. But we see that inflated value continually going up, and away, if you will. Superman type style, I guess. But you can't do that, I don't think, based upon the value on a free and natural person. Now, a corporation, that is an asset to them, and it goes on their ledger sheets as such, and you can tax the property and the value of the land or property owned by the corporation. The natural person, in order for it to be a direct tax, should be applied to him by acre. If he owns 10 acres, then he pays more than the person with 1 acre.
Well, another reason for that, too, is because you can't valuate another man's land. If it's his property, he has the total use and disposition of it. And if he wants to give it away for nothing, he can, and therefore the value of the land to him was simply what he gave it away for. To come out there and tell a man what his land is worth is to, in effect, sell it out from under him at your bid, not his.
Sell it before him? How does that work?
Well, if you sell a piece of property that you don't own and somebody else owns.
Are you saying it's market day in London?
Every day is market day in London. And that's the custom of merchants. That's another subject. We don't want to run over into that today. But anyway, obviously a man has the right to set the price on his own goods. No other man has that right, much less county assessor.
I'm just going to cover one last thing on this property. I'm going to let George talk to you a little bit. I'm looking under the word liberty now, because these words are all intertwined, and you find them everywhere you go. But under the word liberty in Bovier's Law Dictionary, we find that one of the four things that we have under liberty is the protection of individual property. The protection. That's what we get from our government. They're supposed to protect our individual property. And that requires unrestrained action in producing and exchanging, the prohibition of unfair monopolies, commercial freedom, and the guarantee that no property shall be taken except in due course of law. Due course of law being eminent domain. I think that's the only way you can legally take a man's land from him. The principle that taxation shall only be with the consent of the taxpayer and for short periods only, and the exclusion of confiscation. Now that's what we've been trying to tell you all this time. And there it is again. Let me read it again. Protection of individual property. The principle that taxation shall only be with the consent of the taxpayer and for short periods only, and the exclusion of confiscation. In other words, you've got to tax property for short periods of time. And they did this before in the wars, and I think it was around the Civil War time they did this in one particular case. They taxed property for a short period, and they pulled back, got away from it, because it was only for a short period for a specific purpose. And once that specific purpose had been met, they had to discontinue the taxing of property. And even if a man couldn't pay that tax, you could not confiscate his property. You just can't take a man's property. If you can, again, he doesn't own it, and you've got a feudal relationship. Every officer must be responsible to the affected person for the legality of his act, and no act must not be done for which someone is not responsible. Now, if your county agents are taking your property from you, they're acting in an irresponsible manner. And so any time that you have a damage or something like that, or for every inappropriate action, there's got to be a remedy at law. And this is where you have to go into your courts and get redress for these problems. They cannot tax a man's property, and every time they tax our property, we've got to object to it. We've got to get in the courts and find out how to argue this issue and get it up to the Supreme Court where we can get a ruling. I'm convinced for myself, from my reading and understanding of the law, that you cannot take my property unless it's for eminent domain. Now, there are exceptions to that. If a man has a valid debt, and I'm not talking about a debt for taxes, but if a man owes another man, for example, seed and grain and barley and rye, and he goes to the feed store and he spends money for that and he gets this stuff and he doesn't pay for it, the other man has a right of action against him. And maybe we're going to have to take some of his land or make him do something to pay that just debt. And there may be exception to this eminent domain in that sense. But other than that, you cannot take a man's property, and certainly government can't take it. But that's what we see our government doing every day. So we would encourage you to search out this property issue even further than what we've done so today, and see if you can't get this into your courts, and see if we can't get some relief for the government taking our property away from us without due process under the law.
When we're talking about property, we have to keep in mind that there's a practical aspect of buying, selling, trading, holding property, and disposing of our property, and hanging on to our property and keeping it away from the government. It's our observation that what we've got now in the United States, where our government was charged with the protection of our life, liberty, and property, that now not only have they abrogated the responsibility of defending and protecting our lives, liberty, and property, they are the very people who are stealing our lives, liberty, and property. They put us in jail. They take our property without due process of law. And then they'll even go so far as to keep it, and in the case that I'm going to tell you about right now, charge you $4,000 after they've stolen it from you. Now, that doesn't mean that we're defenseless and that there's nothing we can do about it, but you know, the average layman that goes into the courtroom gets laid away is doing so because he isn't trained and he hasn't got any warning. He hasn't been told ahead of time what to expect. So listen to this story. This is the true story of George Gordon and the 1965 Chevrolet automobile and the 1972 Honda motorcycle. Now, as you know, I don't have a driver's license, and my car's not registered, and I don't carry any insurance, and so my government now is attempting to blackmail, coerce, threaten, and intimidate me into complying with these type of regulations which are proper regulations to corporations, remember, under the Hale Doctrine, that's Hale versus Hinkle, but that they're absolutely illegal and unlawful pursuant to the Marbury Doctrine, and that's Marbury versus Madison of 1803. So I'm claiming to own this 1965 automobile and the 1972 motorcycle as a matter of chattel. They are property. I own them. And according to our state constitution in Idaho, I have a right to do that. Article 1, Section 1. And, of course, the Declaration of Independence, and, of course, our federal constitution guarantees me the right to life, liberty, and property. So I'm driving down the street one day with my brother. The officer stops me, and he arrests me. And then he calls a towing company and seizes my motorcycle. My brother is sitting on the motorcycle, and so am I. I have taken the motorcycle and I put it on private property. I didn't stop on a public right-of-way. And then I told the officer, this is my agent, and he'll take my motorcycle. He ordered my brother off the motorcycle, threatened to arrest him if he stuck around. My brother left, and they took my motorcycle. And they did not take it for evidence. They took it for safekeeping. And they sent it out to a private wrecking company, charged $25 for the towing, $3.50 for the storage, and then wouldn't tell me where it was for 3 weeks. I had to motion it up by discovery to find out where it was. By the time I got out there, the bill was something like $60 or $80 or $90, and then it went up to $168, and right now it sits at a couple thousand. Then 2 weeks later, the same officer, holding Curbstone Court, grabbed my automobile, which was a 1965 Chevrolet, and did the very same thing. So now my government sits with both of my pieces of property. So I filed a trover action in the district court, and we argued the trover action about a year later, and the jury came in and found in favor of Officer, let's call him Jones. Officer Jones, I had charged with malicious conduct, and that he had, what did we charge him with? Oh, a number of things. And we had to prove the criminal intent. And the judge changed my action from a trover to a civil tort pursuant to Idaho Code 6-901, which practically exonerates the city. In other words, you have to have their permission to sue. Now, I don't want to get into the technicalities of the suit, because when you file a Title 42, Section 1983 suit, a replevin, or a trover action to regain your property, what I want to do is show you how the nuts and bolts and the practicalities of it work. Notice that the automobile was an older model car, an extremely valuable piece of merchandise that I valued at $1,600 because it was a classic and because it was restored. And that car was a one-of-a-kind, and you'll never find another 1965 Chevrolet like it. Now, the motorcycle was in absolute like-new condition. I valued that at $1,500, and I filed suit for $20 a day for each and every day that the towing company had my car, that I was deprived of it, and $10 a day for each and every day that they had my motorcycle. Now, you may want to do the same thing, but I'd like to caution you, don't take the license plates off of your 1983 Rolls-Royce or your Mercedes-Benz. Go ahead and register those. When you do, throw your license plates away to test the law in your particular area. Try a 1964 Pontiac or a 1972 Chevrolet, one that isn't worth quite so much money. One that's worth a tremendous amount in sentimental value and a tremendous amount as a classic and a tremendous amount as personal chattel, but isn't worth very much in the way of dollars and cents to a stranger. And you know, another thing is that you should never own anything yourself, and I'll tell you why. After I lost the case, they sent me a bill here for $3,810. So they're going to go out and hire a very prestigious law firm. And this prestigious law firm, then, not only are they going to steal your property, but then they're going to try to collect the attorney's and fees and court costs. Now, this attorney fee here for $3,810 is just one of the two attorneys, and the court costs are still to come in for a 3-day trial.